Introduction. If you want to know the truth, people who talk about legacy are usually the biggest phonies you'll ever meet. They act like rotting wood is holy just because their grandfather touched it. It kills me. I'm Aria Harvey. 15 years ago, my parents locked me out in a blizzard because my brother lied to cover his own ass. It was cold enough to freeze your lungs, I'm not kidding. Now I'm back, holding the deed to their house, and they don't even recognize me. Before I tear their charade apart, please, like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. So, I stood on that sidewalk, and the wind was sharp as a knife. The wind coming off Hollow Creek wasn't just cold. It was wet, heavy, and malicious. It was the kind of damp that ignored wool and went straight for the bone. I stood on the cracked sidewalk, tightening the belt of my charcoal trench coat. It was cashmere tailored in Chicago and cost more than the sedan parked at the curb behind me. It was a shield, a layer of armor against this town that had tried to break me, but even the best fabric couldn't stop the shiver that ran up my spine. I looked up at the building. The sign above the double oak doors read, Hollow Creek Heritage Center, but the gold leaf was peeling and the C in center hung crookedly by a single rusted nail. To anyone else, it was just a sad old Victorian structure in a dying Rust Belt town. But I wasn't anyone else. I was Aria Harvey, and I didn't look at buildings with sentiment. I looked at them with geometry and physics. My eyes traced the roofline. The eaves were sagging at least 4 inches on the east side. That meant the load-bearing trusses were compromised, likely from water damage. I looked at the brickwork near the foundation. The mortar was crumbling, turned to dust by decades of freeze-thaw cycles that nobody had bothered to seal. The porch, the grand sweeping wraparound porch they used to be so proud of, was propped up on the left corner by what looked like a stack of cinder blocks and a prayer. It wasn't a legacy. It was a lawsuit waiting to happen. I gripped the leather handle of my portfolio until my knuckles turned white inside my leather gloves. The bag was heavy, but not because of the blueprints or the structural assessment reports. It was heavy because of the single crisp document filed in the back pocket, the deed of trust. I owned this rot. I owned the peeling paint, the sagging roof, and the debt attached to it. And the people inside, the ones desperately trying to save it, didn't have a clue who I was. A gust of wind tore down the street, rattling the bare branches of the oak tree in the front yard. The sound was sharp, like a whip crack. Suddenly, I wasn't 31. I wasn't a senior partner at Harvey and Associates. I was 16. The year was 2011. The calendar said March, but the weather said the dead of winter. It was the blizzard that shut down the county for 3 days, the one everyone still talked about in the coffee shop on Main Street. But I didn't remember the snow depth. I remembered the cold on my face because I wasn't wearing a coat. I was wearing a thin gray zip-up hoodie over my school uniform. I stood on the bottom step of this same porch. The snow was already over my sneakers, soaking into my socks, numbing my toes until they felt like stones. "Please," I said. My voice was small, swallowed by the howling wind. "Dad, please, it's freezing." My father, Robert, stood in the doorway. He looked like a giant, then broad-shouldered and terrifying. He was blocking the warmth of the hallway, blocking the smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen. In his hand, he held a blue envelope. It was crumpled, his fist squeezing it so hard the paper was tearing. "I won't house a thief," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It was flat, final. We scrimped, we saved, That money was for the restoration. It was for the family. I didn't take it, I cried, my teeth chattering so hard I could barely form the words. I swear, Dad, check my room again, check my locker. We found the envelope under your mattress. Aria, empty. Behind him, lurking in the warmth of the foyer, was Julian. He was 18, the golden boy, the one who was going to take over the business. He had a look on his face that I would never forget, a mix of mock concern and terrifying calm. I saw her, Dad, Julian said, his voice smooth. I didn't want to say anything, but I saw her with those guys behind the gym, the ones who sell the pills. I think she has a problem. It was a lie, a clean, precise, devastating lie. Julian owed $3,000 to a bookie in the next town over. I knew it. He knew I knew it. But he had gotten to them first. Julian is lying, I screamed, stepping up one step. Robert didn't blink. He looked at me with a disgust that burned hotter than the cold. Don't you dare blame your brother for your sickness. He's the only one looking out for this family's future. I looked past them into the shadows of the hall. Mom. Sarah was there. She was wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked at me, her daughter, standing in a blizzard without a coat, and her face crumpled. But she didn't step forward. She didn't argue. She looked at Robert's angry. Back then, she looked at me, and she lowered her eyes. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen. That silence hurt more than the cold. Go, Robert said. Don't come back until you have the money or you're clean. We're done. He stepped back. The heavy oak door swung shut. Then came the sound. Click, clack, the deadbolt sliding home. It was a heavy mechanical sound, the sound of a prison cell closing or a coffin. I stood there for 10 minutes, banging on the wood until my hands bled, screaming into the wind until my throat was raw. They never opened it. I walked 4 miles to the shelter in the storm. The wind whipped my hair across my face, snapping me back to the present. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, bird-like rhythm that defied my calm exterior. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of wood smoke and exhaust. I was 31. I had a condo overlooking the lake. I had 6 figures in the bank. I was safe. I walked up the stairs. The wood groaned under my boots' heels, not sneakers. I reached for the door handle. It was the same brass latch, now tarnished black with oxidation. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, half expecting it to be locked, half expecting Robert to be standing there to block my path. I pushed. The door groaned open. The lobby smelled exactly as I remembered, damp wool floor wax and the stale bitterness of old coffee. It was dimmer than I recalled, the overhead chandelier missing half its bulbs. Hello, I called out. My voice was steady, professional. A door opened at the back of the hall, the office. 2 figures emerged. For a moment, I didn't recognize them. The giant who had blocked the door was gone. In his place was a man who looked shrunken, his flannel shirt hanging loosely on a frame that had lost its muscle. Robert walked with a slight limp, his hair entirely white. Beside him was Sarah. She looked brittle, like a dried flower that might disintegrate if you touched it. She was wiping her hands on a dish towel, the same nervous tick from 15 years ago. They stopped a few feet away from me. They looked tired, defeated. Their eyes scanned my face, taking in the expensive coat, the leather bag, the stern set of my jaw. I waited for the recognition. I waited for the gasp, the guilt, the anger. I waited for my mother to drop the towel. Robert extended a trembling hand, forcing a polite, desperate smile. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice raspy. "You must be the auditor from the Historical Grant Society. We've been waiting for you. Please come in. We have the kettle on." I stared at his hand. He didn't know me. I was a stranger to them. I didn't shake his hand. I just nodded, clutching the deed inside my bag a little tighter. "I'm Ms. Harvey," I said, "and we have a lot to discuss." "Follow me," Robert said, his voice echoing too loudly in the cavernous entryway. "The Grand Hall is just through here. It's the heart of the center. The original woodwork is all 1920s white oak. You don't see craftsmanship like that anymore." I followed him, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. The sound was distinct, a rhythmic, authoritative percussion that contrasted with Robert's shuffling gait. Sarah trailed behind us, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron, a silent shadow in her own home. We passed through a set of double doors into the main assembly room. It was massive, intended for town balls and community theater, but now it felt like a mausoleum. The air here was colder than in the lobby, heavy with the scent of dust and something sharper, more organic wet rot. "We've hosted weddings here," Robert said, sweeping his arm across the empty space. "Town councils, the mayor's jagged little speeches. This room is the legacy of Hollow Creek." I stopped in the center of the room. I didn't look at the stage or the faded velvet curtains that Robert was gesturing toward. I looked up. The ceiling was a vaulted masterpiece of timber framing, but to my eye, it was a crime scene. The central ridge beam had a subtle, terrifying bow to it. The load path, the invisible line where the weight of the roof transferred to the walls, was interrupted. "The roof," I said, cutting off Robert's anecdote about a wedding from 1998. "When was it last shingled?" Robert blinked, pulled out of his reverie. "Oh, well, we've done patch repairs, as needed. We're very diligent." I walked toward the east wall. The plaster there was covered in a fresh coat of beige paint, but the texture was wrong. It was lumpy, uneven. "Ms. Harvey, really the architecture is quite—" I ignored him. I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy silver ballpoint pen. I stepped up to the wall right where the crown molding met the plaster. "Robert," Sarah whispered, sensing the tension. "Maybe she'd like some tea first." "Legacy doesn't hold up a roof, Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice low. "Structural integrity does." I pressed the blunt end of the pen into the wall. I didn't have to push hard. The instrument punched through the drywall as if it were wet cardboard. It sank 2 inches deep, disappearing into the void behind the paint. When I pulled it back, the tip was coated in a black, slimy residue. Robert stared at the hole, his mouth slightly open. His face flushed a deep, humiliated red. "You painted over black mold," I said. It wasn't a question. "You didn't remediate the water intrusion. You just covered it up." It was a cosmetic fix," Robert stammered, his bluster deflating instantly. "We were going to address the piping next month. We just wanted it to look presentable for the assessment, for the grant." "This isn't piping," I said, wiping the pen on a handkerchief I produced from my pocket. "This is exterior runoff. The flashing on your chimney has failed. The water is running down the inside of the load-bearing studs. This beam," I pointed to the timber above our heads, "it has shifted 3 inches because the wall supporting it is turning into mulch." The silence that followed was suffocating. I looked at Robert, the man who had once terrified me with his booming voice and absolute authority, and I felt a strange, hollow pity. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had let his pride outpace his competence. He was drowning, and instead of swimming, he was painting the water beige. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling. We've tried so hard. It's just, the winter was so harsh. And the heating bill. She looked at me with pleading eyes. We have Earl Grey, and I made scones. Please, it's cold in here. Let's go to the office where the space heater is. For a second, the mask slipped. I remembered those scones. I remembered the smell of flour and dried cranberries that used to fill the kitchen on Sunday mornings, before the money vanished, before the accusations. I felt a phantom ache in my chest, a desire to be the daughter who sat at the table and let her mother fix things with sugar and warm water. But I wasn't that daughter. I was the bank. I was the law. I don't want tea, Mrs. Thorne, I said, keeping my tone cool and detached. I want to see the maintenance logs. We were in the back office, a cramped room cluttered with filing cabinets and stacks of yellowing paper, when the front door slammed open. The noise reverberated through the building, followed by heavy, confident footsteps. Dad, Mom, where is this suit? The voice was deeper than I remembered, raspy from cigarettes, but the cadence was identical. Arrogant, rushed. Julian appeared in the doorway of the office. He brought a gust of cold air and the overpowering scent of cheap cologne with him. He was 33 now. He wore a navy blue suit that was too shiny under the fluorescent lights, the kind of synthetic fabric that sparked when you moved. On his wrist sat a gold watch that was almost certainly a knockoff, excessively large, designed to catch the eye from across a room. He stopped when he saw me. His eyes raked over my coat, my hair, my portfolio. He didn't see a sister. He saw a target. He saw money. You must be the lady from the Preservation Society, he said, stepping into the room and crowding the small space. He extended a hand, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Julian Thorne. I manage the operations here. Sorry I'm late. Had a meeting with the zoning board. Bureaucracy, right? I didn't take his hand. I just looked at it until he awkwardly withdrew it, smoothing his tie to cover the rejection. Ms. Harvey, I said. Right, Ms. Harvey. He leaned against a filing cabinet, crossing his arms. He winked at Robert, a gesture meant to say, I've got this. Look, my parents here, they're the heart of the place, but they get bogged down in the sentimental stuff. I'm the numbers guy. If you have questions about the viability of the project, I'm your man. Good, I said, because the numbers are exactly what I'm interested in. I sat down at the small metal desk, taking the seat that Robert usually occupied. It was a power move, and I saw Robert flinch, but he didn't stop me. I opened my portfolio, not revealing the deed, but pulling out a legal pad and a copy of their public tax filings I had prepared. I've reviewed your grant application for the 2024 Historical Preservation Fund, I said, uncapping my pen. You're asking for $200,000. It's a big place, Julian said, his smile tight. Lots of overhead. I also reviewed the report from the last grant you received in 2023. $50,000 specifically allocated for roof restoration and weatherproofing. I looked up at him over the rim of my glasses. I just inspected the east wing. The roof hasn't been touched in a decade. The flashing is rusted through. The gutters are detached. Julian shifted his weight. Well, you know how construction is. Cost overruns. We had to divert some of those funds to emergency plumbing. The basement flooded. Show me, I said. Excuse me? The invoices. I said. If you diverted restricted grant money to plumbing, you would need to file a variance request, which you didn't. But assuming it was an emergency, you would have invoices from a licensed plumber. Show them to me. The room went quiet. The space heater hummed in the corner, glowing orange. Julian laughed a nervous hacking sound. Ms. Harvey, you're coming in a little hot, aren't you? We're a small family nonprofit. We don't keep files like a Fortune 500 company. The accountant, Mr. Henderson, he has all that. He's not in today. I'm not asking Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice hardening. I'm asking you. You're the numbers guy, aren't you? Sarah spoke up from the corner, her voice small. Julian, just show her the receipt from the plumber, the one who fixed the leak last spring. Julian shot his mother a look of pure venom. It was brief, a flash of the cruelty I remembered from my teenage years before he smoothed his face back into a mask of beleaguered businessman. Mom, please, let me handle the professional side. He turned back to me, his charm evaporating, replaced by a defensive aggression. Look, this is confidential internal data. I don't know who you think you are walking in here and demanding. I think I'm the person holding the checkbook. I lied. The checkbook I held was my own, not the grant committee's, but the leverage was the same. And if you want this facility to remain standing, you will answer me. I stood up, closing the distance between us. I was wearing 3-inch heels, which put me eye to level with him. The roof repairs listed in your 2023 report don't exist, Julian. The money is gone, just like the restoration fund vanished 15 years ago. His eyes widened. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. I had stepped too close to the truth, too close to the specific history of the house. How do you know about that? He whispered. I do my homework, I said, keeping my face impassive. Now, the logs, the bank statements. Or do I walk out that door and mark this application as fraudulent? Julian swallowed. He looked at Robert, then at the door, realizing his charm offensive had failed spectacularly. He was trapped. He couldn't show me the books because the books would show theft. But he couldn't refuse me, or the grant would disappear. Let's go to the boardroom, he said, his voice tight. There's more space. I can explain the discrepancies. Lead the way, I said. Robert and Sarah looked at each other, bewildered by the shift in power. They had expected a savior, but they had invited a prosecutor into their home. They shuffled out of the office, heads down. I waited for Julian to pass me. As he did, I smelled the stale alcohol beneath the cologne. He was sweating. I followed them toward the boardroom. The wind outside howled, rattling the single-pane windows, sounding exactly like a child crying to be let in. I tightened my grip on the portfolio. The boardroom was colder than the hallway. It was a vast, austere space dominated by a long mahogany table that had been scratched and water-ringed by 40 years of community arguments. The wind outside had picked up, howling against the north wall, rattling the single-pane windows in their loose sashes. It sounded like the building was chattering its teeth. I walked to the head of the table. I didn't ask permission. I simply took the seat of authority, placing my leather portfolio on the wood with a heavy, deliberate thud. Robert and Sarah sat together on the left, huddled like defendants awaiting a verdict. Julian sat on the right, leaning back in his chair, trying to look bored. But his leg was bouncing beneath the table. The vibration shook the water pitcher. Let's cut to the chase, I said, keeping my hands folded on top of the leather case. There will be no grant. There will be no funding from the Historical Society. Robert straightened up, his face reddening. Now see here, Ms. Harvey, we have a legacy. You have a liability. I interrupted, my voice sharp and precise. I've seen enough in 20 minutes to shut this building down. The load-bearing truss in the main hall is compromised. The electrical system is a fire hazard. The black mold you painted over is a Class 1 health violation. I leaned forward, locking eyes with Robert. This building isn't a heritage site, Mr. Thorne. It's a corpse, and you're the one who killed it. Robert slammed his fist on the table. The sound was like a gunshot in the empty room. You have no right, he shouted, his voice cracking with the strain. This is our home. We have protected it for 40 years. We poured our blood into these floorboards. You poured your ego into them. I countered, my volume not rising in decibel. You ignored the rot because fixing it was too expensive and admitting it was too painful. You let the foundation crumble while you polished the brass handles. I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Just like you did with your family. The air in the room changed. It shifted from administrative tension to something personal, something dangerous. Robert stood up. He was shaking. Get out. Get out of my building. I don't care who sent you. Sit down, Dad, Julian muttered, looking nervous. Let's not. I said get out, Robert roared, pointing a trembling finger at the door. You come in here insulting my work, insulting my wife. Who do you think you are? I stood up slowly. I unbuttoned the collar of my trench coat. I reached up and unwound the cashmere scarf from my neck, letting it fall onto the chair behind me. I took off my glasses and set them on the table. For the first time since I walked in, I looked at Sarah. I didn't look at her as an auditor. I looked at her as the child who had begged her to open the door. I'm the girl you left in the snow, Dad, I said softly. Robert froze. His finger was still pointing at the door, but his arm began to lower inch by inch as if the strength was draining out of him. He squinted, the anger on his face morphing into confusion and then slowly into a horrific recognition. Aria, Sarah whispered. The name came out as a gasp, a reflex. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide and wet. You kicked me out, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. 15 years ago, on that porch, you told me not to come back until I had the money. I tapped the portfolio. I have the money now. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind stopped howling for a brief second, leaving a vacuum in the room. Robert sank back into his chair. He looked gray. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Aria, but the drugs, the theft. I never stole a dime, I said, and I never touched a drug in my life. I put myself through architectural school. I graduated top of my class. I built skyscrapers in Chicago while you were painting over mold in Hollow Creek. This is bullshit. Julian jumped up. The chair screeched against the floor. He looked panic-stricken. The narrative he had carefully constructed for 15 years, the narrative of the saintly brother and the junkie sister, was disintegrating in seconds. She's lying, Julian yelled, looking desperately at his parents. She's just here to screw with us. She wants revenge. Look at her. She's probably high right now. Julian, stop, Sarah sobbed, reaching for Robert's arm. No. Don't you see what she's doing? Julian pointed at me, his face twisted in a sneer. She's trying to evict us. She wants to see us on the street. That's why she's here with her fake briefcase and her expensive coat. She wants to destroy the center. I didn't come to destroy it, I said, my gaze shifting to Julian. I came to save it from you. From me? Julian laughed, a high, hysterical sound. I'm the only reason this place is still standing. I handle the accounts. I handle the legal. I know you do, I said. I opened the portfolio. And that brings us to the real reason I'm here. I pulled out a document. It was thick stapled and bound in a blue legal cover. I didn't hand it to Julian. I slid it across the mahogany table toward Robert. What is this? Robert whispered, staring at the paper as if it were a bomb. It's the deed of trust, I said. Robert looked up confused. We have the deed. It's in the safe. No, I said. You have a piece of paper in the safe. The bank has the deed, or rather, they did. What are you talking about? Read the signature line on the last page, Dad. Robert flipped the document open with trembling hands. Sarah leaned in, clutching his shoulder. I watched their eyes scan the text. I watched the moment the words registered. Magna Corp Developers, Robert read aloud. Purchase agreement date, October 14th. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for this to be another lie. We never sold to Magna Corp. We never signed this. Turn the page, I said. He turned it. There at the bottom were two signatures. Robert Thorne, Sarah Thorne. That's my signature, Robert whispered. But I didn't sign this. And that's mine, Sarah cried. I've never seen this paper in my life. I know you haven't, I said. I turned my head slowly toward Julian. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was backing away toward the door, his face pale, sweat beading visibly on his forehead. Julian, Robert asked. His voice was barely audible. It's a forgery, Julian stammered. She faked it. She printed that out. It was notarized by a clerk in the next county. I said, my voice cold and clinical. A clerk who happens to be your poker buddy, Julian. I checked. I stood up and walked around the table, standing behind my parents, facing my brother. 3 months ago, Julian sold the Hollow Creek Heritage Center to Magna Corp for $400,000, I stated. The money went into an offshore account, which was immediately drained to pay off gambling debts in Atlantic City. I have the wire transfer records. Robert looked at Julian. The look wasn't anger anymore. It was a shattering. It was the look of a man watching his entire world dissolve. You sold it, Robert wheezed. You sold our home? I had to, Julian screamed, finally snapping. I was in the hole. They were going to break my legs, Dad. And this place is a money pit. It's worthless. I did you a favor. And the lease back, I asked. Tell them about the lease back, Julian. Julian clamped his mouth shut. He arranged a 90-day leaseback clause, I explained to my parents. Magna Corp agreed to let you stay in the building for 3 months after the sale so you wouldn't get suspicious. They were just waiting for the term to expire. I checked my watch. The term expired yesterday. Magna Corp had a demolition crew scheduled for Monday morning. They were going to bulldoze this building with your furniture still inside. Sarah let out a wail, a sound of pure heartbreak. She buried her face in Robert's shoulder. Robert just stared at his son, his mouth opening and closing, no sound coming out. But you, Robert looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. You said you have the deed? I do, I said. I bought it from Magna Corp this morning, I said. I paid a premium to stop the demolition order. I own the building now, not the bank, not the developers, me. I looked at Julian. He was cornered, vibrating with adrenaline and fear. The sister you called a thief just spent $500,000 to save the roof over your head, I said, while the son you protected sold it for scrap. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. It was heavy with 15 years of lies finally collapsing under the weight of the truth. The wind rattled the glass again, but inside, the storm had finally broken. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a structure that had just lost its primary support beam. The air in the boardroom felt thin, as if the truth had sucked all the oxygen out of the space. Julian was the first to break it. He didn't apologize. He didn't fall to his knees. He pushed his chair back, the metal legs shrieking against the hardwood floor, and began to pace. It was a frantic, cornered movement. "Don't look at me like that," he snapped, gesturing wildly at his parents. "You think I wanted to sell? You think this was easy? I did it for us." "You sold our home," Sarah whispered. Her voice was barely a ghost of a sound. She was staring at the table, her hands trembling so violently she had to clasp them together to stop the motion. "To a demolition crew? It's not a home, Mom. It's a tomb," Julian yelled, his face flushing a blotchy red. "Look around you, it smells like rot, it eats money. The heating bill alone was drowning us. I got 400 grand for this pile of bricks. I was going to invest it. I was going to turn it into millions. I was going to buy you a condo in Florida." "You gambled it," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I watched him from the head of the table, feeling a strange, detached sadness. He wasn't the terrifying older brother anymore. He was just a small, desperate man in a cheap suit. "You lost the deposit in a weekend, and then you lost the principal trying to win it back." "That was bad luck." Julian pointed a shaking finger at me. "You don't understand business. You take risks. Sometimes you lose. But at least I was trying to do something. I was trying to free them from this anchor." Robert slowly turned his head. He looked at Julian as if seeing him for the first time. The adoration, the blind faith that had shielded Julian for decades, it was gone. In its place was a dull, gray horror. "You forged my name," Robert said. The words were heavy like stones dropping into a well. "You sat at this table where my father sat, and you signed my name to sell his legacy." "I had to," Julian cried, his voice cracking. "You wouldn't listen. You're so obsessed with tradition. You couldn't see we were broke. I made the executive decision." "You're a criminal," Robert said. He slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him. The patriarch, the man who prided himself on law and order, looked suddenly frail. He looked old. I watched them. I had spent 15 years imagining this moment. I had imagined it feeling like a triumph, like a crescendo of vindication. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like watching a demolition in slow motion. The dust was choking, not cleansing. "We're done with the present," I said, drawing their attention back to me. "We know who sold the building. We know who ruined the finances." I stood up and walked to the double doors of the boardroom. "But there is still one accounting error left to fix." I opened the door, standing in the hallway, clutching a worn leather briefcase to his chest like a shield was Mr. Henderson. He was 72, now a man made of elbows and tweed. He had been the family accountant since before I was born. He was Robert's oldest friend, a man who came to every Christmas party, who sat on the porch and drank iced tea while Robert pontificated about politics. Come in, Arthur, I said softly. Mr. Henderson stepped into the room. He didn't look at Julian. He couldn't bring himself to look at Robert. He kept his eyes on his scuffed loafers. Henderson, Robert squinted, confused. What are you doing here? Did she call you? I called him, I said. Last week, when I bought the deed. Mr. Henderson walked to the table with a timid, shuffling gait. He placed his briefcase on the mahogany surface and clicked the latches open. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. He pulled out a single black ledger. It wasn't digital. It was one of the old hand-bound books he used to swear by. Arthur, Robert asked, his voice wavering. What is this? Mr. Henderson took a deep breath. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses and wiped them on his tie. When he spoke, his voice was thin, but it didn't shake. I've kept the records, Bob. All of them, for 40 years. He opened the book to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. The date at the top of the column was February 14th, 2011. The Restoration Fund, Henderson said. 15 years ago. The missing $12,000. Robert stiffened. We know where that went. Aria took it. No, Henderson said. He finally looked up, meeting his old friend's eyes. She didn't. Julian made a noise, a sort of strangled gasp, and moved toward the accountant. This is irrelevant. That was years ago. Old man, you don't know what... Sit down, Julian, I said. The command was sharp enough to freeze him. Henderson turned the book so Robert could see it. He pointed to a line item. Withdrawal $12,000. Cash. Henderson read. Authorized by Julian Thorne. He reached into the pocket of the ledger and pulled out a yellowed slip of paper. It was a withdrawal slip from the local credit union. And here is the slip, Henderson continued. Signed by Julian. I was at the bank that morning, Bob. I saw him take it, and I saw him drive away in that red Mustang he claimed he bought with investment returns. Sarah let out a sob. It was a raw, wounded sound. She remembered the Mustang. They had been so proud of him for buying it. Robert stared at the ledger. He stared at the signature on the slip. It was unmistakable, the same jagged J that was on the forged deed. You knew, Robert whispered. He looked at Henderson with a betrayal that went deeper than money. You knew, Arthur, when I kicked her out, when I threw her into the snow, you knew she was innocent. Henderson flinched. Shame washed over his face, turning his pale skin blotchy. I knew, Henderson admitted. But I was afraid of you, Bob. The confession hung in the air. You were so angry, Henderson said quietly. You were so certain. And Julian, he was your pride. I told myself it was a family matter. I told myself I didn't want to lose your business. I was a coward. He looked at me, his eyes wet. I watched that little girl walk away down the driveway, Henderson said to the room, and I let her go because I was too scared to tell my best friend he was a fool. He closed the ledger. When Ms. Harvey called me, when she told me she was coming back, I knew I couldn't be quiet anymore. I'm sorry, Bob. I'm so sorry. Robert sat frozen. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow. The narrative of his life, the righteous father, the betrayed patriarch, shattered completely. He hadn't just lost his building. He hadn't just been swindled by his son. He had exiled his innocent daughter to protect the guilty one. He had been wrong about everything. He looked at Julian. Julian didn't have a comeback this time. The evidence was physical. The witness was unimpeachable. The timeline of his deceit was now complete, stretching from his teenage years to his 30s. He slumped against the wall, defeated. Robert slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. He looked at the woman in the charcoal coat, the architect who had bought his failures. Aria, he choked out. He tried to say more, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing to say. The apology was too big for his throat. I looked at them, my mother weeping into her hands, my father broken by the truth my brother exposed as a fraud. I closed my portfolio. The click of the lock was the only sound in the room. You have no defense, I said. You have no money. You have no building. You have nothing but what I decide to leave you. I turned to the window. The snow had started to fall again, large silent flakes drifting down to cover the decay of the town. Now, I said, we are going to talk about the future. The snow was falling heavier now, thick white flakes clinging to the glass of the boardroom windows, sealing us inside. The world outside the town that had forgotten me, the winter that had once tried to freeze me, felt very far away. Inside, the only sound was the hum of the electric heater in the corner and the ragged breathing of my family. I turned away from the window and looked at them. I held the silence in my hands. It was a physical weight heavier than the portfolio, heavier than the deed. In this moment, I possessed the absolute power of destruction. I could snap my fingers, or rather dial a number on my phone, and the police would be here for Julian. I could call the sheriff to evict my parents. I could send them out into the blizzard with nothing but the clothes on their backs, mirroring the exact cruelty they had visited upon me 15 years ago. It would be poetic justice. It would be the kind of revenge they write country songs about. I looked at Julian sweating through his cheap suit. I looked at Robert slumped and broken, staring at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. I looked at Sarah, who was wiping her eyes with the edge of her apron, a woman eroded by decades of silence. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. But then I looked at the ceiling. I looked at the water stains on the crown molding. I looked at the structure itself. If you demolish a building because the foundation is weak, all you have left is a pile of rubble. And rubble serves no one. I walked back to the table. I didn't sit down. I stood at the head, my shadow stretching long across the mahogany. Julian, I said. My brother jumped. He looked at me, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit, looking for an ally. He found neither. Robert refused to look up. Henderson was busy polishing his glasses, distancing himself from the crime he had helped unveil. You are going to sign a document, I said, sliding a single sheet of paper from the back of my portfolio. I had prepared it in the car, a contingency plan I hadn't been sure I would use. This is a voluntary severance agreement. It states that you are resigning from the board of directors effective immediately and surrendering all management responsibilities of the center. Julian stared at the paper. And if I don't, then Mr. Henderson gives the ledger to the district attorney. I said simply, forgery is a felony, Julian. So is embezzlement. You're looking at 5 to 10 years. Julian's face went pale. He looked at his father. Dad, you're going to let her do this? Robert raised his head. His eyes were dull, the fire completely extinguished. You sold the house, Julian. You sold us. Julian sneered, a flash of the old arrogance trying to spark, but it died quickly. He snatched the pen from the table. He signed the paper with a violent scratch, tearing the fibers of the page. Get out, I said. Where am I supposed to go? I don't care, I said, but you can't stay here. Go to the city, go to rehab, Fix yourself. If you set foot on this property before you are clean, I will press charges." Julian stood up. He grabbed his coat. He looked at us one last time, a tableau of his failure, and then he stormed out. The heavy double doors slammed shut, the echo bouncing around the empty hall. The air in the room instantly felt lighter. The rot had been excised. Now it was just the three of us, and the ghost of the girl I used to be. I picked up the deed, the Magna Corp sale agreement that I had purchased, and the heavy ring of keys that Julian had left on the table. I walked over to Robert. He flinched as I approached, as if he expected me to strike him. He looked up, and I saw a man who was terrified, not of the cold, but of the judgment of his child. "I suppose," Robert's voice cracked, "I suppose we have a few days to pack. The apartment upstairs, there's a lot of furniture." "No," I said. Sarah let out a small, sharp cry. "You aren't packing," I said, "and you aren't leaving." I placed the keys on the table in front of him. They clattered loudly, a sound of metal on wood, not a sound of finality, but of commencement. "I own the building now," I told them, keeping my voice level, stripped of any malice. "I hold the deed. That means I make the decisions, and my decision is that the demolition is canceled." Robert stared at the keys. He reached out a trembling hand, but didn't touch them. "I don't understand." "I am going to fund the restoration myself," I said. "We will fix the roof first, then the foundation. We will strip the mold and reinforce the trusses. It will take a year, maybe two." "But why?" Sarah asked, stepping out from behind her husband's chair. "After what we did to you, we abandoned you, Aria. We chose him." "Yes," I said, "you did. I didn't offer them forgiveness. I didn't hug them and tell them it was okay. It wasn't okay. The scar on my heart was just as permanent as the water damage on the walls. Trust is not a renewable resource. Once it's burned, it's gone." "I'm not doing this for you," I said, looking Robert in the eye. "I'm doing it because I am an architect. My job is to see the value in things that other people have given up on." I buttoned my coat. "You can stay in the manager's apartment," I continued. "You can live here rent-free, but you don't run the business anymore. I'll hire a proper director. You can give tours. You can tell your stories. You can enjoy the legacy. But the ownership is mine." Robert picked up the keys. He held them to his chest, his eyes filling with tears. "Aria, thank you. I don't deserve it." "No," I said, brutally, honestly. "You don't. But that's the point of mercy, isn't it? If you deserved it, it would just be a transaction." I turned to Mr. Henderson. "Arthur, I'll need you to file the transfer paperwork on Monday." "Of course, Ms. Harvey," the old accountant said, looking at me with a reverence he had never shown my father. I walked to the door. Aria. It was my mother. She had taken a step toward me. Her arms were slightly open, a hesitant, tragic invitation. I paused. I felt the pull of it, the biological imperative to fall into her arms and pretend the last 15 years hadn't happened. But I stayed where I was. I was the load-bearing wall now. I couldn't lean. "Goodbye, Mom," I said softly. I pushed the doors open and walked out. The lobby was cold, but it wasn't the biting, deadly cold of my memory. It was just winter. I stepped out onto the porch. The wind had died down. The snow was falling in straight, soft lines, covering the cracked pavement, covering the weeds, covering the sins of the past in a clean, white blanket. I walked down the steps, not shivering, not running. I walked with the measured pace of the owner. I reached my car and opened the door. The interior was warm, the leather seat welcoming. As I started the engine, I looked back at the Heritage Center one last time. It was still broken. It was still sagging. It was a mess of bad decisions and neglected maintenance. But it was standing. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I hadn't fixed my family. I knew that. You can't retrofit people the way you can a Victorian cornice. The distance between us would remain a necessary span to keep the structure stable. But I had stopped the demolition. I had chosen not to be the hammer. In the end, justice wasn't about burning the house down to prove a point. It was about ensuring that when the storm came, the roof held. I drove out of Hollow Creek, leaving the past in the rearview mirror, steering toward the skyline I had built for myself. I felt light. I felt clean. I was the architect. And for the first time in my life, the design was entirely my own. Aria chose dignity over destruction. Have you ever had to show mercy to family members who betrayed you? Don't be shy to share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. We truly appreciate you being here. There are even more captivating stories waiting for you right on your screen. Please click one now so you don't miss the ending. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.